I went over these very briefly, but there's one in particular that I want to dive into that's the most surprising to people, aside from the good companies have pressure to compromise. So this one I find very interesting. In fact, I spoke to a judge, a very respected judge, who works at my gym, and we were on the treadmills together, and he said, no, people don't compromise their values and not realize it. They know. And the truth is, no, we don't always know when we're crossing a line. There are a lot of psychological factors that go into that. Most of us think we are the good guys. How about, right? Don't you assume, like, we're the good guys, right? They've actually done studies that show that well over half, 70 or 80% of the people surveyed in these studies, and by different people over time, think that they have higher ethics than everyone else, are fairer, are less motivated by money, and trying harder to do good than the average person, including the people who aren't, right? So we tend to have a lot of confidence in our ethics and our ability to see values choices and respond appropriately. The disturbing thing is, it's not necessarily all having a moral compass. It's not necessarily personal character. We are very susceptible to situational forces as creatures, and we don't like to know. This is really disturbing, so be prepared for a moment, but there's a positive side to it. The most compelling example of this is the Milgram experiments that were done in the 60s. Are most of you familiar with those? Anyone? I'll briefly outline them. There's some things about them that most people don't know. The first thing is that these experiments were designed to prove that Americans were not as compliant as Germans. So we wouldn't have fallen into Hitler's tricks. And they didn't show that. He did studies with thousands of people of different education levels, demographics, occupations. And he put people in situations where they were supposed to be helping a scientist, studying the process of learning, helping someone else learn something, using electric shocks as behavioral feedback. It's kind of gruesome. And since then, there have been a lot of improvements in the ethics of doing experiments because it was so disturbing to the people that were involved. What you had to do was, if the person got the wrong answer, you had to give them a little shock. And the scientist would tell you when to do this. Now, you were really the subject of the experiment. You thought you were being paid to be an assistant, and this person was. They were a Confederate, and they were trained to scream and yell and make all kinds of sounds of discomfort while you were doing your shocks, and the shocks weren't real. The dial went all the way from 0 up to danger, brain damage, and death. 63% of the people went all the way to death when told to by a scientist in a white coat. And the instructions for this were, if someone refuses 3 times, you can stop. The scientist was, but their response was, the experiment requires you to continue. And people were crying, they were going through great anxiety, but they kept doing it because the authority figure told them. The twist is that Milgram then went on and did 19 variations on when do people comply more and when do they comply less. I think this is the fascinating part. When you didn't have to touch the dial, there was a second assistant who actually turned it, compliance went from 63% to 90%. Picture what that means when we work in offices that are 2,000 miles from the place that we're affecting, right? You don't have to feel it. And then the good news, so now I'll relieve things a little bit, was that when someone witnessed 2 people arguing over whether it was ethical to do this, compliance went from 63% to less than 10%. Just 2 people. So if you think about whether you're going to speak up in a situation, you might be the person that tips someone else, right? So since then, there have been more ethical approaches to replicating this, where they stop the person before they actually do the harmful thing, but the patterns Milgram identified hold.